My name is Rachel Morgan, and I am 34 years old. From the outside, my family looked perfect. Old money, a mansion in Greenwich, and memberships at the finest country clubs. But behind those white columns, I was never treated like a daughter. I was the one ordered to scrub, to serve, to disappear, while my younger sister was praised like royalty. For years, my father introduced me to his guests as nothing more than the maid. Every word cut deeper than the last, but I swallowed it, believing that silence kept the peace. Until New Year's Eve. That night when he demanded I cook an extravagant 7-course feast for his most powerful friends and sneered at me in front of everyone, something inside me broke. What followed didn't just shatter the image of our family's perfection. It turned their glittering celebration into a scandal that spread through every corner of our world. And the very next morning, the CEO they longed to impress looked me straight in the eye and called me one word my father never had: boss. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe. Smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. My father, Edward Morgan, was the kind of man who believed his word was law. He had built a reputation in real estate before retiring early, and now his entire identity revolved around maintaining his status at the Greenwich Country Club. He carried himself like he owned every room he entered, and in our home that was true. My mother Helen played the part of the elegant wife, charity boards, luncheons, and fundraisers. And then there was my younger sister Samantha, 6 years younger than me, bright, polished, always described as the future of the family. She ran a small PR firm financed in part by my parents, and every achievement of hers was broadcast to anyone willing to listen. And then there was me, the invisible one. I remember being 15, standing in our cavernous kitchen scrubbing pans while the sound of laughter drifted from the living room. My father had told me to help prepare hors d'oeuvres for one of his gatherings. Samantha, barely 9 at the time, was allowed to sit with the guests, passing around trays with a smile, collecting compliments for simply existing. I, on the other hand, was told to stay out of sight and make myself useful. That phrase became the soundtrack of my teenage years. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every summer party. While Samantha floated around in a new dress bought by my parents, I was stuck at the stove. I learned to set the table for 40 without asking questions. I learned how to serve without being noticed. And every time I walked past the living room carrying a platter, I felt myself disappearing a little more. There was one evening I will never forget. A formal dinner, 20 guests seated around the long mahogany table in our dining room. My father was in his element, pouring wine and bragging about his connections. At one point, a guest turned to him and asked, "And what about your older daughter? What is Rachel doing these days?" I froze at the doorway, holding a tray of roasted vegetables. My father chuckled, waved a dismissive hand toward me, and said, "Oh, Rachel, she's our maid. Keeps the kitchen running." The table erupted in polite laughter, the kind of laughter people give when they don't know whether it's appropriate. My face burned, and I kept my eyes on the tray, forcing my hands not to shake. My mother smiled tightly, adding, "She's very helpful around the house." Helpful? That word cut deeper than any insult. Samantha, sitting in a pale blue dress with pearls at her neck, leaned closer to one of the guests and said, "Daddy's exaggerating, of course," though the pride in her eyes told me she liked the idea of me being the servant. The guest patted her hand, saying, "You're very lucky to have such support at home." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw down the tray and demand they see me. But I didn't. I simply placed the food on the table and stepped back into the shadows, exactly where my family preferred me to be. That was my life, being the background figure in a household obsessed with appearances. My father introduced Samantha as our successful one, the PR star. When I stood nearby, he would say, "Rachel's here too. She helps out." It was as if my very existence was reduced to utility, stripped of identity. The memories flood me even now, the clatter of silver trays, the smell of garlic roasting, the echo of laughter that never included me. Every detail etched into my mind like a scar. I remember another moment standing in the kitchen as the party roared on when one of the guests wandered in, confused, holding his glass. He looked at me, then looked around. "Are you the help?" he asked. Before I could answer, my father appeared behind him, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, Yes, she takes care of things back here. Keeps everything running smoothly. The man nodded unconcerned and returned to the dining room. My father turned to me and said quietly, almost with disdain, "See, that's your place. Don't forget it. Invisible." That was how it felt. As if my worth ended where the kitchen walls began. Now, years later, when I close my eyes, I still see the faces of those guests. Polite smiles, awkward glances, quickly turning back to Samantha as if I had never been there. The shame of those nights lingered long after the dishes were washed and stacked away. I can still feel the sting of standing in that room, hearing my father's voice loud and certain. "This is Rachel, our maid." And I can still feel the silence that followed, the silence that said everything they didn't have the courage to speak aloud. That I was not truly part of the picture, just the shadow behind it. That memory has stayed with me sharper than any knife I held in that kitchen. And as much as I tried to bury it, the truth is, it shaped me more than I ever wanted to admit. The phone call came just after breakfast, my father's voice sharp and commanding as always. "Rachel," he said, not bothering with a greeting, "we're hosting the New Year's Eve party this year at the house. It will be the event of the season." I sat at my kitchen table in Manhattan, staring at the half-finished cup of coffee in front of me. His words carried the same tone they always did. Final, like a verdict. "Dad, I already have plans. He cut me off, and you'll cancel them. This is important. Everyone from the country club will be there. And listen carefully, Victoria Lynn, the CEO of Pinnacle Hospitality, will be attending." The name hit me like a jolt. Victoria Lynn. The very person I was scheduled to meet in Miami the morning after New Year's Eve. The contract that could change everything for Aurora events. He had no idea, of course. To him, she was just another powerful connection to impress another jewel in the family's social crown. I could picture it as he spoke the Morgan estate in Greenwich, dressed to the nines for the holiday. White lights strung across the columns, crystal chandeliers glowing in the windows, silver and gold streamers waiting for the midnight countdown. My mother would be rehearsing her gracious hostess smile, Samantha would be planning her outfit, and my father would be strutting around like a king welcoming his court. "Dad," I said carefully, "I can't do it this year. I have a business commitment." He laughed, a sound that dripped with mockery. "Business commitment. Don't start with your fantasies again. You've been playing at this little catering hobby long enough. This is real. This is family. And you will handle the menu." My jaw tightened. "I have a company to run." "You have nothing," he snapped. "Don't embarrass yourself. You'll be here by noon on the 31st. I want a 7-course dinner properly plated, 12 wines each matched to the course. The dining room set with the Waterford and the Sterling. Do you understand me?" The old pressure pressed down on me, the weight of years of orders disguised as fatherly expectation. I wanted to scream that Aurora events wasn't a hobby, that my contracts were worth more than he could imagine, that his contempt didn't erase the truth. But the words stuck in my throat. "Dad, I really can't. Don't pretend," he barked. "You're nothing but a maid in this family. Don't forget it." The word slammed into me, familiar and searing. Maid. He had called me that in front of guests before, but hearing it now over the phone was no less cutting. I gripped the edge of my table, my nails digging into the wood. "I'm not your maid." His voice lowered, cold and deliberate. "If you refuse, then don't bother calling me your father again. You'll be dead to me." The line went quiet after that, his threat hanging like a guillotine above me. My chest heaved, fury and hurt battling in my veins. He had used ultimatums before, but this one felt sharper, heavier. I stood up and paced my apartment, the city buzzing faintly outside my windows. I thought of the estate in Greenwich. Guests in gowns and tuxedos, laughter echoing in the grand hall. I thought of the countdown at midnight, champagne glasses raised high. And I saw myself not at the table but in the kitchen, sweating over sauces, arranging hors d'oeuvres, invisible as always. Then I thought of Miami, the suite booked under my name at Pinnacle Resort, the boardroom where I would present Aurora events to Victoria Lynn herself, the contract worth $2.5 million waiting for a signature. The contrast was almost unbearable. My phone buzzed again with a text from Samantha. "Dad says you're cooking tomorrow. Don't screw it up. This is huge." A string of champagne emojis followed. I exhaled sharply, my anger twisting into something colder, more focused. She didn't know either. None of them knew. And why would they? They had never asked, never cared to listen. I sat back down, my hands trembling, and opened my planner. January 1st, 9th. 0 a.m. Meeting with Pinnacle Hospitality. It was highlighted in bold, the culmination of months of negotiations. Missing it was not an option. For a moment I closed my eyes and imagined it, standing in front of Victoria Lynn, presenting my company, hearing her say yes. And then hours later, my father finding out that the woman he had dismissed as a maid was the very boss his guests were trying to impress. The thought steadied me. But it also terrified me, because between now and then I had to make a choice that could sever the last fragile threads binding me to my family. The phone buzzed once more. Another message from my father. "Don't disappoint me, Rachel. Noon tomorrow. Be there." I placed the phone face down on the table, my pulse loud in my ears. The war between my past and my future had never felt so immediate. And now, with the clock ticking toward New Year's Eve, I knew the collision was inevitable. In 2015, I had nothing but $6,000 in savings and a stubborn refusal to be invisible any longer. I rented a tiny walk-up in Queens, a one-bedroom where the kitchen doubled as my office. I bought folding tables off Craigslist, borrowed chairs from a friend, and hauled everything myself in the back of a rented van. I remember the sting in my arms from carrying trays up and down narrow staircases, the way my back ached after 12-hour days, and how my hands smelled like garlic and lemon long after I scrubbed them clean. The first event I catered was for 20 people at a modest anniversary party. I did the shopping at dawn, carried every grocery bag alone, cooked for hours until my legs went numb. When I served the food, the guests complimented me politely, and for the first time in years, I felt seen, not as someone's maid, but as a professional. That night, as I counted out the few $100s I made, I thought, this is just the beginning. Every dollar I earned went back into the business. I bought better knives, sturdier trays, and eventually a second-hand commercial oven. I drove across the city at midnight to drop off linens. I designed menus at 2 a.m, fueled by black coffee and adrenaline. The exhaustion was bone deep, but it was mine. Every success, every mistake, every sacrifice, I owned them. And yet at home in Greenwich, nothing changed. I still got the same dismissive questions. At Sunday dinners, my father would ask Samantha about her clients, nodding proudly as she named a cosmetics company or a local politician. Then he would glance at me with a smirk and say, "So, still cooking little dinners here and there." One Thanksgiving, I told him I had signed a catering contract with Marriott for a regional conference. His response? A short laugh. "So, you're making finger foods for hotel staff now?" "That's cute." "Rachel!" The table laughed with him. My mother pressed her napkin to her lips, trying to hide her smile, and Samantha rolled her eyes. I sat there in silence, my stomach twisting, reminding myself not to let it show. Inside, though, something hardened. They could laugh all they wanted. I knew what that contract meant. By 2018, Aurora Events had grown enough to lease its own small office in Midtown. I hired my first full-time assistant, then a sous chef, then a driver. The workload multiplied, but so did the recognition. I was quoted in Hospitality Today, featured in a local magazine. Still, when I mentioned any of it at family gatherings, the subject was changed instantly. My mother would say, "That's nice, dear," and then pivot to Samantha's latest PR campaign as if my words had never been spoken. The ultimate insult came the summer I visited home and found my old bedroom gone. I opened the door and stared into a storage room overflowing with Samantha's dresses, shoes, and handbags. The walls that once held my trophies and books were hidden behind garment racks. My desk, the one where I used to write essays late at night, was stacked with shoe boxes. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling, "what happened to my room?" Helen barely looked up from her laptop where she was scrolling through charity board emails. Oh, Sam needed more space for her clients. She entertains here sometimes. You don't live here anymore, Rachel, so it made sense. Made sense. I stood in that doorway for a long time, feeling as though my entire existence had been boxed up and shoved into the basement. I wasn't just invisible anymore. I was erased. That night, lying awake in the guest room, I promised myself I would never rely on them again. My family had chosen their star, and it wasn't me. Fine. I would become my own star even if they never looked my way. Years passed. Aurora events expanded to Chicago, then Miami. By 2022, we had 80 employees, 4 offices, and a client list that included Fortune 500 companies. I had built something powerful out of nothing, and yet in my parents' eyes, I was still just the maid. I pulled a leather folder from my desk drawer that evening in my apartment. Inside was the draft contract with Pinnacle Hospitality Group worth $2.5 million. I traced the embossed letters at the top. Aurora Events. In gold. This wasn't finger food. This wasn't a hobby. This was the culmination of years of sweat sacrifice and silent determination. Holding that folder in my hands, I felt the clash of two realities. In one, I was still the daughter dismissed as useless, the one whose childhood room had been turned into storage. In the other, I was a CEO on the brink of signing the biggest deal of my career. The dissonance was almost unbearable. But as I stared at my signature on the draft pages, one thought crystallized in my mind. Soon the truth would no longer be hidden. And when it finally came out, they wouldn't be able to laugh it away. I laid my suitcase open on the bed, carefully folding a navy blazer and a silk blouse into its depths. The city outside my window hummed with pre-holiday noise. Horns, laughter, the faint wail of a siren somewhere far away. In my Upper West Side apartment, though it was quiet except for the insistent vibration of my phone against the counter, another voicemail from my father. His voice clipped and hard filled the room when I finally played it. You get back here tomorrow. Noon. Do not embarrass me, Rachel. Don't you dare make me look like a fool. I deleted it without responding, but the words still lodged in my chest like shards of glass. Mom's message came next, her tone softer but no less sharp. Listen to your father. Don't be stubborn. This night means everything to him. To us. And then Samantha's text lit up the screen. This is Dad's big night. Don't screw it up. Don't ruin everything. She added a champagne glass emoji, her favorite way of showing triumph. I set the phone aside, refusing to let their voices fill my head any more than they already did. Instead, I turned back to my laptop, clicking open my email. At the top of my inbox was the message I had been waiting for from my PR manager. The subject line, Forbes cover proof. My heart thudded as I opened it. There it was. The January issue mock-up. My face framed by bold black letters, 40 under 40, Rachel Morgan Aurora Events. For a long moment, I just stared, the glow of the screen painting my apartment in silver light. I should have felt nothing but pride. Years of work, endless sacrifice, every setback overcome. All of it had led to this. A national magazine, my company's name in gold. But the pride was tangled with something bitter. My family had no idea. To them, I was still the maid in the kitchen, the disappointment, the invisible daughter. They would see my name on a magazine rack before they ever heard it from me. I traced my finger across the screen, imagining my father's face when he saw it. Would he laugh? Deny it was me? Or would he finally choke on the truth? The phone buzzed again, breaking the spell. Another voicemail from Dad. I didn't even listen this time. I closed the laptop and reached for the envelope lying on my nightstand. Inside was my plane ticket, New York to Miami, departing tomorrow evening. I held it in both hands, the weight of paper far heavier than it should have been. It wasn't just a ticket. It was a choice. I could go to Greenwich, put on the apron once more, serve a room of men who would never know my name. I could nod when my father introduced me as nothing more than help while Samantha preened and smiled at his side. Or I could board that plane, walk into the Pinnacle Resort, and look Victoria Lynn in the eye as her equal. I could claim the place I had built for myself, far from the shadows of my family's dining room. The choice was obvious, and yet my chest ached. I set the ticket on the desk and pressed my palms to my eyes. My father's voice echoed in the silence. "If you refuse, you're no daughter of mine." Would he really cut me off? Would he erase me from the family entirely? Part of me knew the answer. He already had, long ago. He had erased me when he laughed at my contracts, when he turned my room into storage, when he called me Maid. I exhaled slowly and picked up the ticket again, smoothing its edges. Tomorrow I would leave New York not as a servant, but as a CEO. Still, the thought of severing the last thread of hearing the door slam shut forever behind me sent a chill through me. I carried the suitcase into the hallway and placed it by the front door. My coat hung, waiting on the hook beside it. The city lights blinked beyond the window, and in the distance, fireworks tested the night sky for tomorrow's celebration. I sat back on the couch, the ticket resting in my lap, and let the quiet settle over me. The decision was already made. But knowing it could cost me my family's love, even if that love had never truly existed, was a price I had to be ready to pay. When I was younger, I learned quickly that my father didn't just dismiss what I did. He forbade it from existing in his world. There was a night, maybe 7 years ago, when I had left a contract on the dining table, a proposal from a small hotel in Manhattan. It wasn't huge, but it was my first real corporate deal. I had printed it, left it out, thinking maybe, just maybe, he would notice. Instead, I walked in to find him standing over it, his face twisted with disdain. He picked up the papers, crumpled them in his fists, and tore them clean in half. "Don't shame the Morgan name with this kind of nonsense," he said, voice low but full of venom. "We don't associate with work meant for servants. Do you understand me?" I stood there, 27 years old, feeling like I was 15 again. I nodded because that's what I'd been trained to do. He threw the pieces into the trash, brushed his hands together as though he'd rid himself of dirt, and went back to his bourbon. That night I cried alone in my car before driving back to the city. Those memories came back to me in sharp flashes as I walked to the window of my apartment. Central Park stretched out below, dotted with lights like a constellation mapped onto the earth. Fireworks tests cracked faintly in the distance. Families laughed on the streets preparing for the celebration. The world felt alive, but in me fear gnawed deep. I was used to surrender, to bowing my head, to swallowing every word I wanted to scream. My father's voice was carved into me. "Don't embarrass me. Don't defy me." Even now, with everything I had built, the thought of going against him made my chest tighten. What if he meant it this time? What if he really cut me off forever? My hands shook as I reached for my suitcase handle. I thought of all the times I had chosen him over myself, how each time it cost me a piece of who I was. If I gave in again, there would be nothing left. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ticket on the nightstand. The minutes ticked past. My pulse thudded like a drum. Fear pressed down on me so heavily it felt like a second skin. But beneath it, something else flickered. Anger. A quiet, growing fire. I forced myself up, grabbed my phone, and opened the Uber app. My thumb hovered over the screen before I pressed it. The request went through. Estimated arrival 5 minutes. That was it. I pulled my coat from the hook, slipped it on, and wheeled my suitcase toward the door. My breath came fast, uneven. At the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored wall, pale, tense, but resolute. The ride down felt endless. When the doors slid open into the lobby, the doorman looked up. "Traveling for the holiday, Ms. Morgan." "Yes," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. "I have somewhere important to be." Outside, cold air hit my face, crisp and sharp. The city buzzed with people heading to parties, laughing, shouting for taxis. A black sedan pulled up, the driver leaning across to push open the door. I hesitated for a split second. One last chance to turn back to choose the path I'd always chosen. Then I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle and stepped inside. The car pulled away from the curb, weaving into traffic, Manhattan blurred by lights smearing against the window. My heart pounded as the weight of what I'd done sank in. For the first time in my life, I had told my father no. As the skyline receded, I whispered into the quiet hum of the car words, meant for no one but myself. This time I choose me. The Morgan estate in Greenwich glowed like a postcard that night, every tree on the front lawn wrapped in white lights, candles flickering in the windows. Cars lined the circular drive, sleek black town cars dropping off couples in gowns and tuxedos. The heavy oak doors opened to welcome the stream of guests. Members of the country club, bankers from Stamford, even a state senator shaking hands as he walked in. Inside the great hall smelled of polished wood and perfume. Laughter echoed against the marble floors as coats were taken. Champagne poured, and voices carried up toward the high ceilings. My father, Edward, stood at the center of it all, chest puffed, cheeks flushed with pride. He greeted everyone with the same booming warmth. Tonight, he declared to a small circle of guests, everything has been prepared by my eldest daughter. Rachel takes care of the details. She's always been our maid, and a damn good one at that. The men chuckled politely. The women smiled stiffly. No one questioned him. Why would they? In their world, appearances were fact. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the kitchen behind him was empty. No pots simmering, no ovens glowing, no staff bustling. Just a silent room with bare counters and a refrigerator holding nothing but wine, a jar of mustard, and a forgotten loaf of bread. Helen slipped into the kitchen first, her heels clicking frantically against the tiles. She pulled open the refrigerator door, slammed it shut, and pressed her hand to her forehead. "Oh my God," she muttered. She didn't come. She really didn't come. Samantha followed, phone already in hand. "Calm down," she snapped. "I'll call someone." She scrolled through contacts, pressed a number. "Hi, this is Samantha Morgan. We need a last-minute catering delivery for 30. She paused, eyes narrowing. "What do you mean you're closed?" "It's New Year's Eve, everyone's still open." She hung up, tried another. "Please, we'll pay double." Another rejection. Helen wrung her hands. "Edward is out there telling everyone Rachel's been cooking for days. If they see this, then we don't let them see it." Samantha hissed, dialing again. "Hello?" "Yes, catering." "Oh, you're shut down too." They moved from panic to desperation. Call after call, each one met with the same answer: closed. No one would take a 30-person order on New Year's Eve with less than an hour's notice. Meanwhile, in the dining room, guests began to murmur. The long mahogany table had been set with Waterford crystal and silver flatware, each place gleaming under the chandelier. But the plates remained empty. Waiters never appeared because there were none. My father clapped another man on the shoulder, laughing too loudly, buying time. "Rachel's always been reliable," he insisted. "Any minute now you'll see the spread she's prepared. 7 courses. You'll be talking about it for weeks." Back in the kitchen, Samantha nearly screamed. "No one is open. No one." Helen's voice cracked. "What are we supposed to do?" Silence stretched, broken only by the sound of Samantha's phone buzzing with an alert. She looked down, her lips curling. "Domino's is still taking orders. And Papa John's." Helen blinked at her. "You can't be serious. Do you want Dad humiliated?" Samantha shot back. "It's pizza or nothing." 20 minutes later, delivery men in red and green uniforms carried stacks of greasy boxes through the back door. Helen grabbed her checkbook, shoving $100 bills into their hands, begging them to hurry. Samantha tore the boxes, open steam rising as cardboard hit silver trays. "Put them on the good china." Helen ordered, her voice trembling. "No one has to know." So they laid slices of pepperoni and sausage onto plates rimmed with platinum, setting them carefully in front of cut crystal goblets. Garlic knots rested in silver bowls, marinara poured into gravy boats. When the dining room doors opened, the room fell into silence. Guests stared as the smell of fast food filled the air. Edward turned, his smile faltering. then forced it back into place. Just the first course he boomed, though his voice cracked. Creative twist on tradition. No one laughed. Forks clinked awkwardly against porcelain. The senator raised an eyebrow. A banker whispered to his wife. Someone stifled a laugh. My father lifted his glass, but his hand shook. To family, he said. The words rang hollow. All around him, eyes darted from the crystal stemware to the pizza grease, staining lace tablecloths. The silence was thick, suffocating. And in that moment, though I wasn't there, I knew exactly what it looked like. 30 guests sitting at a table set for royalty, staring down at slices of Domino's and Papa John's. The room that was supposed to showcase my father's power had become the stage for his humiliation. Victoria Lynn arrived later than most, the hem of her black evening coat brushing the marble floor as she stepped into the dining room. Conversations softened, then faltered entirely as she surveyed the table. The smell of garlic and cheap tomato sauce lingered in the air. Boxes had been hastily hidden, but not well. One Domino's logo was visible beneath a chair. Another Papa John's box slumped against the wall. Her face betrayed nothing, only a practiced neutrality honed from years of corporate dinners and boardrooms. She took a seat near the center, her eyes moving slowly across the crystal goblets, the sterling forks, the slices of pizza arranged like trophies on plates that once held caviar. Edward rushed to her side, his laughter booming too loudly. "Ah, Ms. Lynn, so glad you could make it. You'll have to forgive the unconventional spread. My eldest daughter was responsible for tonight. She's useless most of the time, but at least she knows her way around a kitchen." The words spilled out too quickly, his bravado cracking at the edges. Several guests forced small laughs, the kind that came more from discomfort than amusement. One woman covered her mouth with her napkin. A pair of men exchanged glances that said everything they didn't dare speak aloud. Across the room, a young associate pulled out his phone, snapping a photo of the table. Pizza glistening under the chandelier, guests in gowns and tuxedos, staring down in disbelief. Within minutes, that photo appeared online with the caption, "The Morgans' legendary NYE party." With pizza. The image began to spread like shared whispered about by those who hadn't even left their homes yet. Victoria sat straighter in her chair, folding her hands together, and finally turned her gaze toward Edward. She held it there, steady and unblinking, as if weighing not just the food, but the man himself. Edward's smile wavered under the weight of it. He reached for his glass, his hand betraying a slight tremor, and raised it higher than necessary. To improvisation, he said, voice-thin eyes darting from guest to guest. No one lifted their glass. The silence pressed in harder, like a tide filling every corner of the room. Victoria let the pause stretch before she curved her lips into the faintest smile. Not warm, not amused, but something colder, sharper. A smile that said she saw through every word, every mask. Edward shifted in his seat, sweat beading at his temple. He tried again, this time with forced cheer. Well, sometimes even the best laid plans need a little creativity, right? The guests avoided his eyes. Forks scraped softly against porcelain as a few people picked at their slices, trying to normalize what could never be made normal. And still Victoria said nothing. She simply held that faint smile, her gaze locked on Edward like a mirror he couldn't escape. The air in the room thickened with the unspoken truth the Morgans had tried to dazzle, and instead they had revealed themselves stripped bare. When Victoria finally looked away, it wasn't to the food or the guests. It was toward the tall windows where the lights of Greenwich shimmered faintly in the distance, and in that small movement the balance of power shifted, though no one dared to name it. The party went on in sound alone. Muffled chatter, uneasy laughter, the clink of glass. But the atmosphere had already collapsed. And at the center of it, my father sat rigid in his chair, drowning beneath the weight of a single silent smile. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane taxied onto the runway at JFK. the low rumble of engines vibrating through the floor beneath my feet. I hugged my laptop close as if it were armor. The screen still glowed with the email from my PR manager, the final proof of the Forbes cover. There I was, centered on the page, the words 40 under 40, Rachel Morgan Aurora Events, printed boldly above my headshot. My chest tightened, not with nerves, but with a mix of awe and disbelief. I had stared at mock-ups before approved drafts given quotes, but seeing the finished version, knowing it would hit stands across the country on January 1st, felt like stepping into a reality I'd fought for years to claim. Around me, other passengers adjusted their seats, unwrapped blankets, murmured quietly about their own holiday plans. A man across the aisle laughed with his son, already talking about fireworks in Miami. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the normalcy of it wash over me. These strangers didn't know my name, didn't carry the weight of my family's contempt. To them, I was just another traveler heading south for New Year's. When I opened my eyes, I glanced at my phone. 42 missed calls from Dad, 28 from Samantha, a handful from Mom, most of them voicemails. My screen glowed red with urgency, but I felt nothing but exhaustion. The last voicemail I'd listened to had been my father's, his voice low and furious. "You've humiliated me. If you don't get here tonight, you are no daughter of mine." Thud. I let the phone rest in my palm for a moment before holding down the button until the screen went black. The silence that followed was immediate, like a door slamming shut. I leaned back into the seat, staring out the window as the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. Manhattan shimmered beneath us, as the plane lifted the skyline, shrinking, until it was nothing more than a jagged glow on the horizon. For years, leaving them had been unthinkable. Even when they ridiculed me, dismissed me, erased me, I stayed tethered. Fear of losing the scraps of approval they dangled kept me bound. But now with each mile we climbed, I felt the weight loosen. I thought of my team at Aurora Events. Maria in the kitchen, James keeping operations steady, David poring over spreadsheets late at night. 50, 60, 80 people all depending on me. They believed in me in ways my family never had. Their livelihoods were tied to my decisions, their futures shaped by the contracts I fought to secure. I remembered the holiday party just a week earlier. My staff had surprised me with a cake shaped like our logo, their cheers echoing in the rented loft space. To Rachel, James had said, raising his glass, the only boss who believed in us when no one else would. The applause that followed had been louder than anything I'd ever heard in my parents' house. That memory steadied me now. The seatbelt sign dinged and the plane leveled out above the clouds. I pulled a blanket over my lap and reopened my laptop. The Pinnacle contract glowed on the screen, clause after clause lined with my notes. I scrolled to the final page where a blank line waited for my signature. Tomorrow morning at 9, I would sit across from Victoria Lynn in a boardroom at the Miami resort. By 10, if everything went as planned, Aurora Events would secure exclusive catering rights worth $2.5 million. By noon, my name would be etched into the national hospitality market. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, resisting the urge to sign digitally just to see my name there. It wasn't time yet. A flight attendant passed by offering water. I took a cup, thanking her softly, and set it on the tray beside me. My hands finally stopped shaking. I closed the laptop, tucked it into the seat pocket, and let my head fall back against the cushion. For the first time in years, I felt something I barely recognized. Peace. I whispered into the dim hum of the cabin, my voice barely audible even to myself. This time, I choose me. The words lingered as my eyelids grew heavy, the roar of the engines fading into a steady lull. And somewhere between the city I'd left behind and the coast waiting ahead, I allowed myself to exhale. The glass doors slid open as I stepped into the boardroom at the Pinnacle Resort in Miami Beach. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the polished table where half a dozen executives sat. The ocean stretched out behind them, turquoise and endless, but all I could see was the weight of their attention shifting toward me. Victoria Lynn sat at the head of the table, her posture straight, her expression calm but sharp. She had the kind of presence that filled a room without raising her voice. She looked up as I entered, her gaze locking onto mine. For a long second she didn't speak. Then she tilted her head slightly. "Edward Morgan is your father." The question hit harder than I expected, though her tone was almost casual. My throat tightened, but I forced the word out. "Yes." Her lips curved, not in mockery, but in something that resembled amusement. "Interesting," she said, "because last night your father introduced you as his maid." She let the word linger in the air. A knife turned slowly. Then she leaned forward, eyes never leaving mine. "But today I call you boss." A ripple moved through the room. Soft gasps, raised brows, chairs shifting as the board members exchanged quick glances. The silence afterward was electric. I felt the sting of the word Maid all over again. But instead of shrinking, I let the heat rise into my face, let it steel my spine. For a moment I said nothing, my mind replaying the humiliation my father had tossed so carelessly in front of his peers. Then I lifted my chin. A small smile touched my lips. Not triumphant, not bitter. Simply resolute. "Thank you," I said evenly. The words seemed to settle the air. Some of the executives nodded as though acknowledging what had just shifted. For the first time in my life, someone powerful had used the word boss in connection with my name, and it wasn't a token gesture. It was recognition. Victoria's eyes stayed on me, assessing, weighing. She didn't look away when she gestured toward the seat opposite her. "Shall we begin?" I crossed the room slowly, my heels clicking against the tile, and placed my folder on the table. My hands no longer trembled. I slid into the chair, straightened my blazer, and met her gaze head-on. Around us, papers shuffled, pens clicked, the room reassembling itself after the tremor of her words. But inside me something had already broken free. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't dismissed. I wasn't the maid in the background. I was exactly who I had fought to be. And the entire room had just witnessed the turn. Victoria tapped a button on the console at her seat, and the large screen at the end of the boardroom flickered to life. For a moment, the Pinnacle logo filled the space. Then the image shifted, and there it was. The photograph that had already begun to circle online. The Morgan dining room, glittering with chandeliers, Waterford crystal on the table, and stacked pizza boxes clumsily shoved to the side. Guests in tuxedos and gowns stared down at slices of greasy pepperoni and garlic knots, arranged like fine cuisine. The executives around the table leaned forward, some covering their mouths, others exchanging amused glances. A low murmur of laughter spread, restrained but unmistakable. My stomach tightened, but not from shame. I wasn't the one caught in that photo. "This," Victoria said smoothly, "was last night. Edward Morgan, I believe, was your host." "Yes," I answered, steady. She looked down at her phone, scrolled, then pressed call. The room grew quiet as the line rang. "Edward," she said when he answered, her voice sharp, deliberate. "It's Victoria Lynn. I was at your party last night." She paused, listening. "Yes, the one with the pizza." The corner of her mouth twitched. The executives chuckled under their breath. "I just wanted to let you know," she continued, "that I've signed a contract this morning, $2.5 million, with your daughter Rachel Morgan, CEO of Aurora Events." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I could almost hear the static of disbelief. Victoria held the phone out slightly, letting the pause hang for the whole table to absorb. Then, without a word, the call disconnected. She set her phone down, calm as ever, and looked straight at me. "Now," she said, "shall we finalize?" The papers slid across the table, the weight of them more than legal language. It was vindication in ink. I picked up the pen, feeling its cool metal against my fingers. For years I had been the invisible daughter, the maid, the one dismissed with a laugh. Now, in a sunlit boardroom overlooking the Atlantic, the truth was captured in a single stroke. I signed my name Rachel Morgan, the letters bold final, Cameras clicked, the flashes reflecting off the polished table as Pinnacle's team documented the moment. Applause broke out, firm handshakes followed, and my own smile stretched wider than I realized it could. The ink was still drying when I understood everything had changed. By the second week of January, Greenwich was buzzing with a story my family could never bury. The photo from the party had gone viral far beyond LinkedIn. Blogs picked it up, calling it the Pizza Gala of Greenwich. Country club members whispered about it in locker rooms. And my father, once the man everyone greeted first on the golf course, had a new nickname, Papa John's King. He hated it, but it stuck. Every time he walked past the clubhouse, someone smirked. A man he'd once considered a peer asked if he had coupons for the next gathering. Slowly, the invitations stopped arriving. His circle shrank, his pride shriveled with it. My mother fared no better. Helen had built her entire social identity on charity boards and luncheons, the kind where appearances mattered more than causes. Within a month, she was quietly removed from 2 committees. Officially, it was about new leadership, but everyone knew the truth. No one wanted the woman who served delivery pizza at her table representing their causes. Samantha's downfall came quickest. Her PR firm had landed a lucrative $600,000 contract with a luxury beverage company, her crown jewel. But when word spread that she'd tried pitching services to Victoria Lynn in the middle of the pizza fiasco, while grease stained her dress, the contract evaporated. The client emailed her within 48 hours. In light of recent events, we are terminating our partnership. She tried to salvage it, but more clients followed. One after another, they slipped away, unwilling to be associated with her embarrassment. For years, my family had treated me like the shameful one, the invisible one. Now they were the joke. I sat in my apartment one night scrolling through my phone when Mom's text appeared. "We need to talk." I stared at it, my thumb hovering. A part of me, the old part, wanted to answer right away to reassure her to fix things like I always had. But then I remembered her words, her silence, the way she'd let Dad call me Maid again and again without protest. I typed slowly, each word deliberate. When Dad publicly acknowledges me as CEO, then we can talk. I hit send and set the phone down. My chest ached, but it wasn't regret. It was resolve. Minutes later, another message appeared. This time it was from Samantha. "Are you happy now you destroyed us?" I didn't respond. Through the window, the city glittered. Central Park was dark and quiet branches etched against the sky. For the first time, I felt no urge to look back, no pull to soften the blow. The balance had shifted, and this time I wasn't the one carrying the weight. 3 months later, I walked into a quiet restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. The host led me to a private room where a round table was set for 4. My parents were already seated, Samantha beside them. They looked smaller, somehow, not just physically, but in presence, as if the weight of the past months had pressed them down. Edward. My father stood when I entered. For the first time in my life, his eyes didn't carry that commanding spark. He looked nervous, almost humbled. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice catching. "CEO Morgan." The words sounded awkward on his tongue, but they were there. He actually said them. I sat down, folded my napkin across my lap, and waited. Samantha spoke first, her voice stripped of the sharpness it once had. I was jealous she admitted, her hands twisting in her lap. "You were always better at everything. Mom and Dad made me feel special by making you small, and I let it happen. I've started therapy. My counselor says we built a family system where someone had to be the scapegoat, and it was you. I see that now." She looked up at me, her eyes red but steady. "I'm sorry." "Helen." My mother dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her napkin. "Not just for New Year's, Rachel. For 15 years. For never asking about your life, for turning your room into storage, for smiling while your father called you a maid." Her voice broke. "I didn't want to face that you might outgrow the role I'd given you. I thought if I kept you small, you'd stay near. I was wrong." The silence after her words stretched. I let them sit there tasting the weight of their regret. Then I leaned forward. "These are my terms," I said, my voice calm, deliberate. "Equal respect. A public acknowledgement of my success. And never again. Never. Will you call me a maid? Not in anger, not in jest, not in memory." Edward swallowed hard, nodding. His shoulders slumped. The fight gone. "You have my word," he said quietly. I lifted my glass, the stem cool between my fingers. "I don't need your recognition to be a boss, but if you want me as part of this family, these are the conditions." For a moment, no one moved. Then Samantha raised her glass, followed by Helen. At last, Edward did too, his hand trembling slightly. Our glasses touched the sound, sharp and final in the quiet room. I took a sip, setting the glass down with care. Inside, something eased. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But boundaries firm and unshakable. As I looked around that table, I knew I wasn't returning to the family I had left. If they wanted me, it would be as an equal, never as a servant. That was the only way forward. Later, walking out into the cool Manhattan night, I breathed in deeply. For years, revenge had seemed like proving them wrong. But standing on that sidewalk, the city lights reflecting in the glass towers above me, I understood the truth. The real revenge was success. The real revenge was self-respect. And I had both. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told you were less than you are, I want you to remember this. No one gets to define your worth but you. Share your thoughts. Share your stories because someone else might need to hear them tonight. And if you believe in standing tall against the voices that try to keep you small, stay with me here. We have many more stories to tell, and yours might be next.